Tonight, we are going to a year. Not a place, not a civilization. Not en Person. A year. A single year in the long story of human history that was, by almost every measure that matters, by the suffering it caused, by the civilizations it destabilized, by the deaths it brought, by the sheer relentless accumulation of catastrophe upon catastrophe upon catastrophe, the worst year that any human being has ever lived through. The year is 536 AD. You have almost certainly never heard of it. It does not appear in most history curricula. It is not celebrated or mourned in any annual commemoration. The people who lived through it left records in the chronicles of Byzantine monks, in the annals of Chinese court historians, in the ice cores of Greenland and Antarctica, in the tree rings of ancient forests, but their testimony was scattered across the world and across disciplines. And it took modern science to bring it together into a coherent picture. And when that picture emerged, when historians and climatologists and archaeologists began comparing notes in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, what they found was something almost beyond belief. In 536 arms vorgeführt over Europe, the Middle East and parts of Asia, it blotted out the sun. Not for a day, not for a week. For 18 months. 18 months of a sun so dim it cast almost no warmth. 18 months of temperatures dropping across the northern hemisphere. 18 months of failed harvests, dying livestock, spreading famine. A summer in which the temperature in Europe dropped by between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees Celsius enough. In a world of subsistence farming, to mean the difference between survival and starvation. And then, before the world had recovered, more catastrophes followed. A second volcanic eruption, a third. And then, beginning in 541 AD, the most devastating plague in the history of the ancient world, the plague of Justinian, which killed perhaps half the population of the Byzantine Empire and rippled outward to devastate populations from Ireland to Persia. The years from 536 to approximately 660 AD represent what historians now call the late antique Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling and cascading. Disaster that reshaped the political map of the world, ended civilizations, created new ones, and left marks on human culture and memory that we are still living with today. It began with a fog. Tonight, we find out what happened. Breathe slowly, let the darkness be friendly. And let me take you back 15 centuries to the morning when the sun stopped giving warmth. The world before the darkness. The late antique world. To understand what 536 AD meant, you need to understand the world it happened to. The year 536 falls in a period historians call Late Antiquity, the long transition between the classical world of Greece and Rome and the medieval world that followed. It is a period of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary energy. Old structures breaking down, new ones emerging. The world in the middle of one of its great transformations. The Western Roman Empire had formally ended in 476 AD, just 60 years before our story begins. But the ending of the Western Empire had not been a sudden catastrophe. It had been a gradual transformation, the Roman administrative structure slowly being replaced by a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Vandals in North Africa. These kingdoms were not the destruction of Roman civilization. They were its continuation in a new form. Their kings wore Roman titles, used Roman administrative systems, patronized Roman culture and the Latin language, and increasingly converted to Christianity, the religion that had become inseparable from Roman identity in the century since Constantine. In the East, the Roman Empire continued without interruption. We call it the Byzantine Empire for convenience, but the Byzantines called themselves Romans. Their emperor, in 536 AD, was one of the most remarkable figures in all of ancient history. Justinian had come to the throne in 527 AD and had immediately set about the most ambitious project in the history of the later empire, the reconquest of the lost Western territories. His general Belisarius had already, by 536, reconquered North Africa from the Vandals and was in the process of taking Italy back from the Ostrogoths. The dream of a reunited Roman Empire seemed, for a brief and extraordinary moment, within reach. Constantinople, the eastern capital, the city of Constantine, was the largest and richest city in the world. Its population of perhaps 500,000 made it dwarf every other city in Europe and the Middle East. Its trade networks connected the Mediterranean world with China and India through the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean routes. Its art and architecture were producing some of the greatest achievements in the history of human creativity. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 537, would stand for nearly 1,500 years as the largest cathedral in the world. The world of 536 was not a world in simple decline. It was a world of extraordinary vitality and complexity, simultaneously destroying old forms and creating new ones, full of political ambition and cultural creativity and human energy. And then the fog came. The other powers. Before we get to the catastrophe, let me sketch the rest of the world that 536 would affect. In Persia, the Sassanid Empire, Rome's great rival to the east, a sophisticated, urbanized civilization, was at or near its peak. The Sassanid kings maintained a magnificent court at Ctesiphon, near modern Baghdad, and governed an empire stretching from the Euphrates to the borders of India. They were, in 536, engaged in their perpetual Cold War with Byzantium, a conflict of raids and counter-raids, and occasional full-scale wars that had been ongoing for centuries and would continue for a century more, until both empires were fatally weakened and the Arab conquest swept them both away. In Arabia, the peninsula between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, a complex world of trading cities and pastoral tribes was developing. Mecca was already a significant trading center. The religious and political revolution that would produce Islam was still a century away. But the conditions that would make it possible were being prepared by the events of the years after 536. In China, the Northern Wei dynasty was collapsing into the chaos of the Northern Dynasties period. while the south was governed by a succession of short-lived southern dynasties. China in 536 was politically fragmented but culturally vibrant, its Buddhism flourishing, its art and literature at a high point. The reunification of China under the Sui and then Tang dynasties was still decades away. In the steppes of Central Asia, the vast grasslands stretching from Hungary to Mongolia, the nomadic empires that had been disrupting settled. Civilizations for centuries continued their complex dance of migration and conquest. The Avars were rising in the west. The Turks were consolidating in the east. These steppe peoples would be profoundly affected by the climate events of the coming years, and their subsequent migrations would reshape the political map of Eurasia. In Mesoamerica, though the connection to 536's events is more tenuous, the classic Maya civilization was at the beginning of its great flourishing. Cities like Tikal and Kapon were building their great pyramids and developing their calendar and writing systems. This was the world of 536, diverse, complex, interconnected in ways that contemporaries only partially understood. A world of extraordinary human achievement and ordinary human suffering, balanced on the edge of something none of its inhabitants could have seen coming. The evidence we have. Let me pause here and explain how we know what we know about 536 AD. The primary sources, the chronicles and histories written at the time or shortly after, are numerous but scattered. Byzantine chroniclers like John of Lydia and Procopius of Caesarea described the mysterious dimming of the sun and its effects. The Syriac chronicle of John of Ephesus describes the darkness and famine. Chinese court records note anomalous climatic conditions. The Irish annals record crop failures. The chronicle of the Eastern Roman historian Cassiodorus, writing in Italy, describes the sun providing light without warmth like the moon. These accounts from different parts of the world, written in different languages by people who had no contact with each other, describe the same phenomenon. Something had happened to the sun, but it was the scientific evidence that transformed our understanding. Ice cores, cylinders of ice drilled from the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, which preserve a year-by-year chemical record of atmospheric conditions going back hundreds of thousands of years, showed a distinctive signature in the layers, corresponding to 536 AD. Sulfur deposits, the chemical fingerprint of a volcanic eruption, appeared in the ice at levels corresponding to a very large eruption. Tree ring data, the annual growth rings of ancient trees, which are thinner in cold years and thicker in warm ones, show dramatic narrowing in the rings corresponding to 536 and the years immediately following. Trees across the northern hemisphere grew barely at all in 536. Some years showed almost no growth at all. And more recently, microscopic analysis of the ice cores revealed something even more specific. Tiny particles of volcanic glass, tephra, locked in the ice, each one chemically distinctive enough to be matched to a specific volcano. The mystery of 536 was beginning to have an answer. Fog. Let me take you to the morning it began. The sources are not precise enough to give us a specific date. sometime in early 536, perhaps January, perhaps February. People across the Mediterranean world and beyond began to notice something wrong with the sky. The sun was rising as it always did, but it was not the sun they knew. It was dimmer, paler, a strange whitish disk in the sky. Visible to the naked eye, without discomfort, something the real sun, in a clear sky, is too bright to allow. The light it cast was cold and pale and shadowless. It illuminated without warming. John of Byzantine, writing Constantinople, described the sun as providing light like the moon for almost the whole year. Procopius, the great historian of Justinian's reign, wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. Cassiodorus, in Italy, wrote of a blue-colored sun, of a year without a proper summer, of fruit that had ripened without sweetening. The fog, or whatever it was not visible as a fog in the conventional sense. The sky was not uniformly grey. The sun was still visible. But something was in the upper atmosphere scattering and absorbing the sunlight, reducing its warmth without entirely blocking its light. We know now what that something was. Volcanic ash and sulfur dioxide injected into the stratosphere by a massive volcanic eruption can remain suspended in the upper atmosphere for months or years, spreading globally on the stratospheric winds and creating exactly the kind of persistent dimming that the historical sources describe. Someone, somewhere, had erupted with enough force and enough sulfur to veil the sun for 18 months. The question of which volcano and where would take decades of scientific detective work to answer. The catastrophe unfolds. The mystery volcano. For a long time, the eruption of 536 was one of the great mysteries of paleoclimatology. The ice cores showed it clearly. The sulfur was there. The volcanic glass was there. But identifying the specific volcano from the chemical signature of the tephra proved difficult. Different volcanoes produce ash with different chemical compositions, different ratios of silicon, aluminum, potassium, iron, and other elements. And matching the tephra in the ice to a specific volcanic source requires both detailed chemical analysis and a comprehensive database of volcanic ash compositions from around the world. For years, the leading candidate was an Icelandic volcano. Iceland sits on the mid-Atlantic ridge and has a history of massive eruptions with significant climatic effects. But the chemical signature of the 536 tephra did not quite match the known Icelandic volcanoes. Then, in 2018, a team of researchers led by glaciologist Michael Sigel published a paper that changed our understanding. Using new analytical techniques on ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica, they identified the tephra from 536 with a confidence that had not previously been possible. The volcano was in Iceland after all, but a specific part of Iceland, and possibly a specific eruption that had not previously been well characterized. The analysis suggested a very large eruption, large enough to inject massive quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it could spread globally and persist for years. But the story did not end there. Because the 536 eruption, devastating as it was only the beginning. An analysis of the ice cores revealed two more major eruptions in the years that followed, one in 540 AD and another in 547 AD, 3 major volcanic eruptions in 11 years. Each one adding to the atmospheric loading of sulfur and ash. Each one extending and deepening the climatic disruption that the first eruption had begun. The world of the mid-6th century was hit by 3 hammer blows from the Earth itself, one after another, before it had a chance to recover from the first. Summer without sun. Let your breathing slow. Let the images come softly, a world growing cold, a sky that has forgotten how to warm. The immediate effect of the dimming sun was the temperature drop. In the summer of 30s, the summer that should have been the warmest part of the year in the northern hemisphere, temperatures fell dramatically. Ice core data and tree ring analysis suggest that summer temperatures in Europe and parts of Asia dropped by between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees Celsius compared to previous decades. That does not sound like much. In the context of modern climate discussions, where we speak of 1.5 or 2 degree targets, it might even sound familiar. But the context makes all the difference. In the modern world, a 2 degree drop in summer temperatures would be uncomfortable and economically disruptive. In the world of 536 AD, a world of subsistence agriculture, where most people grew their own food or depended directly on local harvests, where there was no global food distribution system. No refrigeration, no ability to import grain from a hemisphere where the harvest had not failed. A 2 degree drop in summer temperatures meant that crops did not ripen. In Central Europe and Scandinavia, the growing season shortened dramatically. Grain that should have ripened by late summer was still green when the autumn frosts came. In some areas, crops failed entirely. In others, they produced perhaps half their normal yield. A world living on the edge of subsistence, as most of the ancient world was. Most of the time cannot absorb a 50% reduction in food production without catastrophic consequences. The famine began. Famine across the world. The chronicles of the mid-6th century are full of references to hunger and death. In China, where the climatic records from 536 describe a summer drought followed by an unusual late frost that destroyed crops, the court records describe famine conditions spreading across multiple provinces. The Northern Wei dynasty, already unstable, was further destabilized by the food crisis. Peasant rebellions, always a feature of Chinese history when harvests failed, multiplied. In the Byzantine Empire, where the chronicles are particularly detailed, the year without summer produced immediate food shortages in many provinces. The urban populations of Constantinople and other major cities, dependent on grain imports from Egypt and North Africa, were somewhat insulated, but only somewhat. The price of food rose. The poor suffered first and most. In Ireland, where the annals of Ulster record the event as a failure of bread from 536 to 539, The famine was severe enough to be remembered for generations. In Scandinavia, where the archaeological evidence is particularly striking, the effects were devastating. Pollen analysis from Scandinavian lake sediments shows a dramatic reduction in agricultural activity beginning in the late 530s. Settlements were abandoned. The farming communities that had been slowly expanding into marginal lands retreated to the more productive lowlands. The population declined. Analysis of skeletal remains from Scandinavian burial sites of this period shows clear signs of nutritional stress, stunted growth, dental and enamel hyperplasia disruptions in tooth development caused by periods of severe malnutrition, and evidence of a population under severe physical stress. People were dying in large numbers from hunger and from the diseases that accompany malnutrition and population displacement. And the cold and the dim sun persisted month after month, through the rest of 536 and into 537 and beyond. The year without summer extended. In the spring of 537, people across the northern hemisphere waited for the sun to return to its normal strength. It did not. The volcanic veil in the stratosphere was still there. The sun was still dimmed. The temperatures were still below normal. And now, for the second year running, the harvests failed or underperformed. The situation was worsening. Food reserves that had cushioned the first year of shortage were running low or exhausted. People who had survived 536 on stored grain and preserved food were now facing a second year of shortage with no reserves. In 540 Eifel, the second major volcanic event occurred. The ice cores show another large sulfur spike. The atmospheric loading that had been slowly diminishing as the first eruptions, aerosols settled out of the stratosphere, was suddenly renewed and amplified. Temperatures fell again. Harvests failed again. And in 541 AD, something else arrived. Something that would prove even more lethal than the cold and the famine. Something that found the weakened, malnourished, stressed populations of the northern hemisphere devastatingly vulnerable. The plague. The Plague of Justinian. The Plague of Justinian is named for the emperor who was reigning when it struck. Justinian himself caught the plague and survived, one of the lucky ones. But the plague that bore his name did not show the same mercy to his subjects. It began in the Port Cistercian 541. From there, following the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world, it spread with terrifying speed. To Alexandria, the great fort. To Constantinople, the largest city in the world, fed by grain ships from Egypt. And from Constantinople outward along every road and sea route that connected the empire. The disease was bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same organism responsible for the Black Death of the 14th century. We know this from ancient DNA extracted from the teeth of plague victims buried in 6th century cemeteries across Europe. Bubonic plague spreads primarily through the bite of infected fleas, which live on rats and other rodents. It produces dramatic and terrifying symptoms, the characteristic buboes. swollen lymph nodes that can grow to the size of an egg in the groin, armpit, or neck, fever, delirium, blackening of the skin from internal bleeding that gives the Black Death its name. Without modern antibiotics, bubonic plague kills approximately 30 to 60% of those it infects. With secondary pneumonic plague, which spreads directly between humans through respiratory droplets, the mortality rate approaches 100%. The plague of Justinian was the first pandemic of bubonic plague in recorded history. The populations it struck had no prior exposure, no evolved resistance, no understanding of its transmission, no effective treatment. The death toll was staggering. The death toll. The ancient sources describe scenes of mass death that strain credulity until you realize that the Black Death of the 14th century, which killed a third of Europe's population, produced scenes that contemporary observers described in almost identical terms. In Constantinople, at the plague's peak, Procopius describes 10,000 people dying per day. This figure is certainly an exaggeration. The city's total population was perhaps 500,000. And even the most lethal plague does not kill at that rate. But it conveys the sense of overwhelming, incomprehensible death that characterized the epidemic's peak. The bodies accumulated faster than the living could bury them. Mass graves were dug. Bodies were thrown into the towers of the city walls. Ships were loaded with corpses and set adrift at sea. The fields were left unworked because there were not enough people to work them. The shops were closed. The streets were empty. The great commercial and administrative machinery of the Byzantine Empire ground to a halt as the population that operated it died or fled. Modern estimates of the plague of Justinian's death toll vary widely. From 15 to 25% of the Byzantine Empire's population in the initial outbreak, with subsequent waves killing millions more. Some estimates suggest that the plague, across its multiple waves over the following 2 centuries, may have killed 25 to 50 million people in the Mediterranean world alone. The world of 541 AD was already weakened by 5 years of volcanic winter, crop failure, and famine. Its people were malnourished and immunologically stressed. Into this weakened world, the most lethal bacterium in human history arrived. The convergence was catastrophic. The world transformed. Justinian's dream dies. Let your breathing slow. Feel the warmth of wherever you are. The catastrophe is 15 centuries behind you. You are safe. Justinian had dreamed of reuniting the Roman Empire. In 536, the very year the sun went dark, his general Belisarius was in Italy, fighting the Ostrogoths, making that dream seem achievable. The Gothic war, the campaign to retake Italy, had begun in 535 and would last, with horrifying consequences for Italy's population until 554 AD. 19 years of war fought across the Italian peninsula, devastating a civilization that had been, under Ostrogothic rule, relatively prosperous and stable. The war and the plague together effectively destroyed the economy and population of Italy. Archaeological evidence shows a dramatic decline in Italian settlements. agriculture, and material culture in the late 6th century. The population of Rome, which had perhaps 500,000 people at the height of the empire, had declined to perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 by the end of the 6th century. A city that had been the capital of the world was becoming a ghost town. Justinian's reconquest succeeded in a narrow military sense. He retook Italy, North Africa, and part of Spain. The formal reunification of the Roman Empire was achieved. But it was a hollow victory. The empire that emerged from the volcanic winters and the plague was a shadow of what Justinian had inherited. The treasury was exhausted. The population was a fraction of what it had been. The military capacity to defend the reconquered territories was simply not there. Within a generation, the Lombards, a Germanic people who had not been significantly affected by the first waves of plague, invaded Italy and took most of it back. The Byzantine reconquest of Italy lasted barely a decade in many areas. Justinian's dream died not in battle but in the convergence of volcano, famine, and plague that made the world he was trying to rebuild ungovernable. The Persian-Byzantine Wars. While the Byzantine world was being devastated by plague and climate disaster, its great rival, the Sassanid Persian Empire, was also suffering. The plague struck Persia as well, following the trade routes that connected the Persian and Byzantine worlds. The Sassanid court at Ctesiphon was not immune. Persian chronicles record massive mortality in the same period that Byzantine chronicles do. But the plague, paradoxically, also intensified the conflict between the two empires. Both were weakened. Both were desperate for resources to feed their populations, to pay their armies, to maintain the infrastructure of imperial power. And in the logic of ancient geopolitics, weakened empires sometimes become more aggressive, not less, as rulers try to compensate for internal weakness with external conquest. The Byzantine-Sassanid wars of the late 6th and early 7th centuries were among the most destructive in the history of either empire. The conflict that began in the 570s and culminated in the early 7th century, with the Persians actually capturing Jerusalem in 614 and Egypt in 619, came close to destroying both empires entirely, which, in a sense, is what happened when the Arab armies burst out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 630s, unified by the new religion of Islam. Energized by a century of religious and political development that had itself been shaped by the disruptions of the volcanic winter era they found too exhausted, plague-weakened, treasury-depleted empires that could not mount effective resistance. The Persian Empire was destroyed entirely. The Byzantine Empire lost Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and North Africa, its wealthiest and most productive provinces, within a generation. The world of 636 AD was unrecognizable compared to the world of 536, and the volcanic winter of 536 was one of the critical triggers of the cascade that produced it. The transformation of the steppe. The events of 536 and after did not affect only the settled. civilizations of the Mediterranean and Middle East, they reverberated across the Eurasian steppe, the vast grasslands that connected Europe to China, with consequences that helped reshape the political map of the medieval world. The nomadic peoples of the steppe lived by herding cattle, horses, sheep, goats, and their way of life was acutely sensitive to climatic changes that affected the productivity of the grasslands. A colder, drier steppe meant less grass, which meant fewer animals, which meant famine and pressure on adjacent populations. The volcanic winters of 536 to 547 reduced steppe productivity significantly. This created pressure on the nomadic confederacies of the Eurasian grasslands, pressure that manifested as outward migration. As weaker groups were pushed out of their territories by stronger ones, and as the surviving groups turned their attention to raiding and conquering the settled civilizations around them. The Avars, a nomadic people whose origins are still debated, appeared on the edges of the Byzantine world in the 550s and 560s, apparently pushed westward by the disruptions of the volcanic winter era. They established a powerful confederacy in the Pannonian Plain, modern Hungary, and would threaten Constantinople repeatedly over the following century. The Turks, who were consolidating their power on the eastern steppe in the same period, established the first Turkic Khaganate in the 550s, creating a steppe empire that stretched from the borders of China to the Black Sea. These migrations and state formations on the steppe had consequences that echoed for centuries. The Avar pressure on the Slavic peoples they dominated drove Slavic migration into the Balkans, the process that gave the Balkans their Slavic-speaking character, which it retains to this day. The disruptions of 536 set in motion a chain of migrations and conquests that would not fully play out for centuries. The medieval world, its ethnic map, its political structures, its religious landscape was shaped in crucial ways by the cold years that followed a volcanic eruption that most people today have never heard of. The Arab world. Perhaps the most consequential long-term effect of the 536 catastrophe was its role in shaping the conditions that made the emergence of Islam possible. The connection is indirect but real. The volcanic winters and associated famines destabilized the complex tribal and commercial networks of the Arabian Peninsula. The plague repeatedly struck the settled populations of the Byzantine and Persian empires, weakening both powers and creating a power vacuum that Arabia's periphery filled with increasing difficulty. Arabia, itself the heartland of what would become the Islamic world, was affected by the climatic changes, but in complex ways. Some areas suffered drought. Others may have benefited from changed rainfall patterns. The overall effect was disruption of established trade routes, of traditional power relationships, of the economic networks that sustained the urban centers of the Hijaz, including Mecca. Into this world of disruption and uncertainty, a new religious and political vision emerged. Muhammad ibn Abdullah, born in Messiah, generation after the worst of the volcanic winter's effects, grew up in a world that had been profoundly shaped by the catastrophes of the preceding decades. The plague, the failed harvests, the political instability of the great empires on Arabia's borders, all of this was the background against which he received his revelations and began his mission. The world that received Islam was a world made vulnerable by decades of catastrophe. A world whose great powers, Byzantine and Sassanid, had been weakened to the point where a newly unified Arabia could, within a generation, sweep away the Persian Empire entirely and strip the Byzantine Empire of its most productive provinces. The volcanic eruption of 536 did not cause Islam. The religious, social, and intellectual currents that produced it are far too complex for any single cause. But the catastrophic disruptions of the 6th century created the conditions, the weakened empires, the destabilized populations, the sense of a world in crisis that made the Arab conquests possible. The world we live in today, its religious landscape, its political divisions, its cultural traditions were shaped in ways too numerous to count by events set in motion by a volcanic eruption that most people have never heard of. The science of catastrophe. How we know. The story of 536 AD is a triumph of modern interdisciplinary science. No single discipline could have reconstructed it on its own. It took the combination of history, climatology, glaciology, dendrochronology, archaeology, and ancient DNA analysis to assemble the full picture. Let me walk you through the key evidence. The ice cores are the most fundamental source. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica accumulate snowfall year by year, and each annual layer preserves a chemical record of the atmosphere at the time of its deposition. Sulfur compounds from volcanic eruptions appear as distinctive spikes in the ice record. Volcanic glass particles, tephra, are preserved in the ice and can be chemically characterized to identify their source volcano. The 536 event appears in multiple ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica, which tells us that the eruption was large enough to spread its products globally through both the northern and southern stratospheric circulation systems. The chemical signature of the sulfur and the composition of the tephra points toward Iceland as the source of the 536 eruption, specifically a large eruption from a volcanic system in Iceland that has not yet been definitively identified. The tree ring record provides the temperature signal. Trees grow 1 ring per year, and the width of the ring reflects the growing conditions of that year: wide rings in warm, wet years, narrow rings in cold, dry years. The ring sequence for 536 AD is one of the most distinctive in the entire 7,000-year tree ring record. Among the narrowest growth rings ever recorded in trees from Europe, Asia, and North America simultaneously. The narrowing begins in 536 and continues, with some variation, through the 540s, confirming the multi-eruption scenario suggested by the ice cores. The cold period implied by the tree rings matches the cold period described in the historical sources. Archaeological evidence fills in the human consequences: abandoned settlements, changes in burial practices, evidence of nutritional stress in skeletal remains, dramatic shifts in pollen records reflecting the abandonment of agricultural land, and the ancient DNA extracted from the teeth of plague victims in 6th century cemeteries across Europe and the Middle East confirms that the plague of Justinian was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death. This molecular evidence, unavailable until the past decade, has transformed our understanding of the plague's nature and reach. Cascading disasters. The story of 536 is ultimately a story about cascading disasters, about how one event triggers another. How systems that seem robust can be destabilized by the right combination of pressures. How the compounding of multiple stresses can produce outcomes far worse than any single event could have caused. The volcanic eruption of 536 caused the cooling. The cooling caused the crop failures. The crop failures caused the famine. The famine weakened populations. The weakened populations were vulnerable to disease. The disease, the plague of Justinian, killed millions. The millions of deaths weakened the empires. The weakened empires could not resist external pressures. The external pressures from the steppe nomads in the north and eventually from the Arab armies in the south reshaped the political map. Each step followed from the previous one. None of it was inevitable at any specific point. A different distribution of the volcanic aerosols might have spared some regions. A different origin for the plague might have changed its spread. A different emperor, a different general. A different religious tradition might have responded differently at any of the crucial junctures. But the cascade happened, and its effects were felt for a century and a half, until the world that emerged was so different from the world of 535 that the two are barely recognizable as the same civilization. This is what historians and climate scientists call a synchronous disaster, multiple severe events occurring in such close temporal proximity that society cannot recover from one before the next arrives. The Volcanic um 540 and 547, the plague of Justinian beginning in 541, the intensification of the Byzantine-Sassanid wars, the Avar migrations. Wave after wave, each finding the world less resilient than the last. The lesson for our own world, which faces its own complex of intersecting risks, is uncomfortable but important. Resilient systems can absorb individual shocks, but the convergence of multiple large shocks in a short time period can overwhelm even the most resilient systems. The Roman-Byzantine world of the early 6th century was, by ancient standards, extraordinarily sophisticated and resilient, and it was brought to its knees by the convergence of cold, famine, and plague in less than a decade. The late antique Little Ice Age, the full climatic period by the eruptions 540 and 547 is now called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. It lasted, according to the ice core and tree ring evidence, from approximately 536 to 660 AD, more than a century of below normal temperatures across the northern hemisphere. It was not a continuous catastrophe of the same intensity throughout. The worst years were 536 to 545, the period of the volcanic aerosol loading and the first devastating waves of plague. After the mid-6th century, temperatures gradually began to recover, though they remained below the pre-536 baseline for generations. But the demographic consequences persisted long after the climate began to recover. Populations that had been reduced by 20, 30, or even 50% in the most affected regions, did not simply bounce back when the harvests improved. Population recovery takes generations, and the political and social structures that had been disrupted or destroyed by the catastrophe did not automatically reassemble when conditions improved. The world of 600 AD was a world of smaller populations, simpler economist urban life, and more localized political authority than the world of 500 AD. Not everywhere. China was beginning to reunify, and parts of the Middle East and Persia were recovering. But across the Mediterranean world and much of northern Europe, the late antique Little Ice Age had accelerated the transformation from the complex, urban, long-distance trade-dependent economy of the Roman world to the more localized, agrarian, village-based economy of the early medieval period. What we used to call the Dark Ages, a term now rightly disfavored by historians for its oversimplification, was in part the political and economic expression of a demographic and climatic catastrophe whose origin was a volcanic eruption in Iceland that no one at the time even knew had happened. The human stories, Procopius and the darkness. Let me bring you closer, down from the level of climate and empire to the level of people. Procopius of Caesarea was the greatest historian of the 6th century. Born in the Palestinian city of Caesarea, he served as the legal secretary and historian to Belisarius, Justinian's great general, and accompanied him on his campaigns in Persia, North Africa, and Italy. He was, therefore, an eyewitness to the most dramatic events of his age, and he was a writer of extraordinary ability, careful, analytical, occasionally sardonic, always attentive to the human reality behind the political and military events he was recording. Procopius noticed the dimming of the sun. He wrote about it in his History of the Wars. The sun, he wrote, gave forth its light without brightness. He noted the coldness of the summer. He noted the disruption of the harvests. He noted the suffering that followed. And then he wrote something else. Something that stands as one of the most extraordinary documents of the age. The Secret History. Procopius wrote the Secret History, which he did not intend to publish in his lifetime, as a savage, unsparing account of Justinian's court, of the emperor's failures and cruelties, of the corruption and incompetence and arbitrary brutality that characterized imperial governance. It is a document of extraordinary bitterness written by a man who had seen too much suffering and had come to believe that the catastrophes of his age were in large part the result of human failure, of rulers who were unworthy of the trust placed in them. Whether or not his judgment of Justinian was fair, and historians continue to debate it, the Secret History captures something real about the experience of living through the convergence of disasters that marked the mid-6th century, the sense of a world coming apart, the search for human explanation for what was, at its root, a natural catastrophe, the anger of the survivor. Procopius did not know about the Icelandic volcano. He could not have known, but he understood with the acuity of a first-class mind confronting overwhelming circumstances. that something fundamental had changed in the world he was living through. The ordinary people. The chronicles give us the great and the powerful, Justinian and Belisarius and Procopius, the emperors and generals and historians. But the worst of the suffering fell, as it always does, on the ordinary people. The farmer in Anatolia who watched his grain fields wither in the cold summer of 536 and knew that his family would not have enough to eat that winter. The shepherd in the Alps who lost half his flock to a late frost and spent the following winter slowly depleting his reserves. The fisherwoman on the Aegean coast who watched the fish stocks decline as the cold waters affected marine ecosystems. The child in Constantinople who survived the plague that killed both parents and was left to navigate a city half emptied of its population. The soldier in Belisarius's army who fought for years in Italy and came home to find his village abandoned and his family gone. The monk in Ireland who recorded in his chronicle the 3-year failure of bread with spare, terrible brevity. The abbot in Syria who organized whatever relief he could for the starving refugees flooding into his monastery. These people did not understand what was happening to them any more than they understood that an Icelandic volcano had begun the cascade that was destroying their world. They understood only hunger and cold and loss and death and the need to survive, to care for whoever remained, to find some way to continue. And many of them did continue. Humanity, as we have observed in every story on this channel, has a remarkable capacity for persistence, for finding ways to endure what seems unendurable, for rebuilding after destruction. The survivors of the 6th century catastrophe built the medieval world, not the world they had hoped for, not the world they had inherited, but a world, a real, living, creative human world that endured and eventually flourished in new forms. What it means, the lessons of 536. What does 536 teach us? It teaches us about the fragility of complex systems. The Roman-Byzantine world of the early 6th century was, by ancient standards, extraordinarily sophisticated, its trade networks, its administrative systems, its agricultural productivity, its urban culture. And it was brought low, not by military defeat or political revolution, but by a volcanic eruption on an island in the North Atlantic, followed by the bacterium Yersinia pestis arriving in an Egyptian port. The complexity that made the ancient world sophisticated also made it vulnerable. The trade networks that brought grain from Egypt to Constantinople also brought plague from Egypt to Constantinople. The roads that connected the empire also connected its disease reservoirs. Interconnection creates both prosperity and fragility. It teaches us about cascading risks. The individual events of the 6th century, the volcanic eruption, the crop failures, the plague, the intensification of political conflicts were each serious. Together, arriving within a decade of each other, they were devastating. The system could absorb any one of them, perhaps even 2, but not all of them simultaneously. It teaches us about the long consequences of environmental disruption. The volcanic winter of 536 lasted 18 months. Its effects on human civilization lasted more than a century. The political and demographic consequences of the late antique Little Ice Age were still being felt in 660 AD to 124 years after the first eruption. The relationship between cause and consequence in complex human systems is not linear. Small triggers can have enormous effects, and those effects ripple outward in time far beyond the initial event. And it teaches us uncomfortably for our own moment about the role of climate in human history. We tend to think of climate as a backdrop, stable, reliable, something that can be assumed rather than analyzed. The story of 536 reminds us that climate is not a backdrop. It is an active force. And when it changes, whether through volcanic aerosols in the stratosphere or through the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the consequences for human civilization can be profound. But the story does not end in catastrophe. The world rebuilt. It always does. By the 7th century, temperatures were beginning to recover. The plague continued in waves, but with decreasing intensity, as populations developed some resistance and as the social disruptions that had facilitated its spread were gradually addressed. New political structures emerged to replace the ones that had been destroyed. The Arab Caliphate that emerged from the conquests of the 630s and 640s was, in many ways, more economically dynamic and culturally productive than the Byzantine and Sassanid empires it replaced. The Silk Road trade revived under Arab and Turkish governance. Cities recovered their populations. In Europe, the Frankish kingdom, which had been less devastated by the 6th century catastrophe than the Mediterranean world, began its slow consolidation into what would eventually become the medieval kingdoms of France, Germany, and their neighbors. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries recovered and transmitted much of the classical learning that had been at risk during the worst of the 6th century crisis. In China, the Sui and Tang dynasties reunified the empire and inaugurated what many historians consider the greatest period of Chinese civilization, the Tang dynasties. Extraordinary cultural flowering, its poetry and painting and international cosmopolitanism, built on the ruins of the fragmented world that the 6th century catastrophe had helped create. Humanity is remarkably resilient. Not because catastrophe doesn't matter, it matters enormously, and the suffering it causes is real and should never be minimized. But because the human capacity to rebuild, to adapt, to find new forms for human life and human creativity appears to be nearly inexhaustible. The world of 700 AD was not the world of 500 AD. It was smaller in some ways, simpler in some ways, harder in some ways. But it was also, in other ways, new religions, new political forms, new artistic traditions, new possibilities. The catastrophe of 536 did not end human history. It changed its direction. Let the fog settle now, gently, in your imagination. Not the cold fog of 536, the other kind. The warm, comfortable fog of approaching sleep. Let the images come softly and let them go. The dim sun over Constantinople. The frozen fields of a summer that forgot to warm. The crowded streets of a city meeting plague for the first time. The scribe who wrote in a cold monastery in Ireland that there was no bread for 3 years. They endured. Through the cold and the hunger and the death, they endured. Not because they were stronger than us or braver than us. Because they had no choice. Because human beings, confronted with catastrophe, find within themselves resources they did not know they possessed. You carry that resilience too. It is in you, inherited across the generations from every ancestor who survived something that seemed unsurvivable. The cold years, the plagues, the wars and famines and the 1,000 ordinary and extraordinary catastrophes that punctuate the long story of human life. Der made it. And their making it is the reason you are here. Let your breathing slow to almost nothing. Let your body be heavy and warm. Outside, the world continues its ancient turning. The same stars that bewildered the people of 536 who looked up at a dim sun by day and tried to read the meaning of their catastrophe in the stars by night, those stars are still burning. The fog lifty always does. The sun came back. And tonight, above you, even if you cannot see it through the ceiling and the clouds, the sun is on the other side of the world. Warming someone else's morning. Your morning will come too. Sleepy well.